Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Furlong, and today we're talking succession. This scene might look familiar to you. Here's a picture of Northwest Ohio. Pretty flat, we have lots of fields, but you know what? It hasn't always looked this way. In fact, if we were going back about 150, 200 years ago, it would have looked something more like this. Very different from the previous picture. Why? Because we were in the middle of what was called the Black Swamp. And so basically what I'm saying is that ecosystems change. This is what is known as an ecological succession. This is a series of more or less predictable changes that occur in a community over time. Now I say more or less predictable because we can kind of predict, depending on what environment we're talking about, as to what it will eventually become and what are some of the intermediate stages will look like as it develops into that type of an ecosystem. And so as we know, ecosystems do change over time, especially after there's been some type of a disturbance. Some species tend to die out. In cases like this, new species tend to move in. There are two types of succession. The first is called primary succession, and this begins when there is no remnant of an older community, or when we have brand new rock that's being formed. And so this diagram is kind of showing us the process of primary succession. As we start with bare rock, and over time it could eventually develop maybe into a forest ecosystem. But over that time we see changes that take place in that ecosystem, and that's what succession is. And so times when this might occur is maybe after a volcanic eruption. Well, let's look at this idea of volcanic eruptions. Here we see Hawaii. The red triangles represents active volcanoes, and they're constantly spewing out lava. When the lava hits the ocean, as we can see in this video, it actually causes the islands to get larger. Now it's a slow process, but as more and more lava is making its way to the ocean, it's making that island bigger in size. And so this is what we see then. New rock that has been formed, and there's nothing living on it. In fact, sometimes this rock can still be very hot, but eventually it starts to cool. And then we see some mosses or lichens beginning to grow on that rock. And through erosion, it starts to break that rock down into soil. And pretty soon you start to get grasses and some weeds growing there. And that continues to break down the soil. And pretty soon you're going to have trees growing. And in a place like Hawaii, ultimately it's going to end up a tropical rainforest, all from that bare rock. That's primary succession. So in primary succession, that very first species to colonize the area is known as a pioneer species. Two very common examples are lichens and mosses. Secondary succession, on the other hand, takes place when the soil has been disturbed. Now the soil was already there, maybe something was even growing on it, but something happened to disturb the soil. So in other words, we're not starting with bare rock. So what can disturb the soil? Well, it could be a fire, hurricanes. It could be something as simple as plowing a field. And this is probably a very common one that you've seen, where after a field has been plowed, maybe the farmer doesn't use that field for a year or two. And you start to see things growing on it. That's succession taking place. Now, of course, secondary succession does happen faster than primary succession because the soil is already there. We don't have to have erosion taking place to help break down that new rock into soil. So as a result, new and surviving vegetation can regrow very rapidly. And this is what we typically see around here, where we might start with a barren field, and even within a year or so, you're going to start to see weeds and grasses growing on it. Pretty soon you're going to start to see taller weeds and maybe some shrubs growing. Ultimately, it's going to reach what's known as the climax community. That is the most stable community reached during the process of succession. So around here, that's going to be a wooded area. So if you've ever been into any types of woods around here, this is what the whole state was like at one time. And this climax community will remain stable until there's another disturbance or until the climate changes. And we can have a whole new ecosystem forming. So that climax community is going to be different from place to place. In Ohio, it's going to be typically a maple forested area. If we were to go to New Mexico, it's going to be a desert area. If we were to go up to Washington State, it's going to be a temperate rainforest biome. And so those are the two types of succession. We're going to take a look at how a mini ecosystem changes over time in class, and I can't wait to see you then.